nameplate was being placed on the head seat of the boardroom table. Brass. Simple. The kind that announced rather than decorated. R. Hargrove, majority shareholder. Victor saw it through the glass wall of the conference room and stopped walking. He had been at Caldwell and Associates for 19 years. He had attended every shareholder meeting, every quarterly review, every board session since Thomas Caldwell made him VP of Operations 6 years ago. He knew every name on every document in this building. He did not know this name. He said, "Nora, who is R. Hargrove? Pull the shareholder file, now." Nora went to pull the file. 2 floors down in the lobby, Diane was speaking with a colleague near the elevator. She was explaining, as she sometimes did when the subject of family came up, that she had grown up largely on her own. An only child, essentially. Small town, nothing worth mentioning. She had not spoken to her mother in 8 months. Victor had not visited in 4 years. The elevator opened at 9:15. Ruth stepped out. She was 74 years old, and she was wearing the floral blouse she wore when she wanted to feel like herself, and she was carrying her small Bible with the quiet deliberateness of someone who has brought it because the day calls for it. She looked at the lobby the way someone looks at a place they have heard about for many years and are finally standing inside. Nora came around the reception desk. She smiled. A real smile, the kind that a woman from a small town gives another woman from a small town when they recognize something in each other. She said, "Mrs. Hargrove, we've been expecting you." Diane heard the name. She turned slowly. Victor came out of the boardroom at the same moment, and they both stood in the lobby of the company they had built their careers in and looked at the woman they had left behind in a small town with a vegetable garden and no forwarding address for their affection. Ruth did not look at them yet. She crossed to the portrait on the lobby wall. Thomas Caldwell painted in the late 1980s the expression he always had, the expression of a man who found the world genuinely interesting and was watching it carefully. Ruth looked at him, the way you look at someone you have known for 52 years and have just lost 6 weeks ago and are still learning how to miss. She touched the frame. "She said I kept the clover, Thomas. I told you I would." Behind her, Nora returned from the filing room. She was carrying a folder. She set it on the reception desk and opened it to the first page, and Victor crossed the lobby and looked at it, the official shareholder record, the controlling block of Caldwell and Associates, and at the top of the page, in the plain type of a legal document that had been in place for longer than either of his children knew, Ruth Elaine Hargrove, majority shareholder, controlling interest. Victor looked at the page. He looked at his mother standing at Thomas Caldwell's portrait with her small Bible and her floral blouse and the quiet of a woman who has driven 2 hours because her late friend's attorney told her it was time. He had not visited in 4 years. He had not wondered in 4 years what the woman in the small town with the vegetable garden might know. He was about to find out that she owned the building he had spent 20 years trying to reach the top of, and that Thomas Caldwell had known the entire time exactly what he was doing. Ruth was in the garden at 6 in the morning, which was when she was always in the garden, which was when the light was right and the air had the particular quality of early summer that made the work feel like a conversation rather than a task. She was labeling seed packets with the same handwriting she had used for 31 years of student papers, the careful, deliberate script of a woman who had always understood that legibility was a form of respect for the person reading. Tomatoes, basil, the pole beans that needed to go in by the end of the week. She set each packet in the wooden tray Gerald Hutchins had made her the year she retired the tray, with her initials carved into the corner, and she worked through the morning in the order the work required. The town of Millhaven was quiet at 6. It was quiet at most hours, which was one of the things Ruth had always appreciated about it, the quality of a place that did not require noise to feel inhabited. She had taught 4th grade here for 3 decades, had known 3 generations of the same families, had attended the funerals of people she had taught as children and the graduations of their grandchildren. She was known in Millhaven in the way that certain people are known in small towns, not as a figure, but as a presence, someone whose absence would be specifically felt. Gerald arrived at 7:45 with his bag over one shoulder and the registered letter in his other hand. He had been delivering Ruth's mail for 11 years, and he had been delivering this particular envelope for as long as she could remember, the cream-colored envelope with the city postmark and the law firm's return address printed in the upper left corner in small, tasteful type. It came every year at the same time, give or take a week, and Gerald had learned in the first year not to ask about it because Ruth received it with the same quality of unhurried recognition she brought to everything, a recognition that was its own form of privacy. He handed it over. She thanked him by name. He went on to the patents. Ruth took the envelope to the porch. She sat in the chair that had been her chair since Harold built the porch in 1978, and she held the envelope for a moment before she opened it. The return address was Bernard Holloway, attorney at Law Holloway and Associates, the city. She had known Bernard's handwriting on the outside of the envelope for 20 years before she ever met him in person, which was the kind of relationship that made complete sense when you understood what the letters contained. She opened it and read it slowly, which was how she read everything that mattered, and when she finished, she read it again, and then she folded it along its original creases and held it in her lap. She opened the Bible. The four-leaf clover was between the pages of Ruth, the book that Thomas had said was appropriate in a way that made her laugh at the time and made her smile now. The clover had been pressed flat for 52 years since the afternoon at the county fair, when she and Thomas were both 22 years old, and she had found it in the grass near the ring toss and held it up, and he had said, "Keep it, Ruthie. You're the luckiest person I know." She placed the letter against the clover and closed the Bible gently. Victor's birthday had been last week. She had thought of him on the day, had sat at the kitchen table with her tea in the morning, and thought of him the way she thought of both her children, with the specific love of a mother who has accepted the shape that love has taken, which in this case was the shape of distance. He had changed his number 3 years ago and had not sent the new one. She had written to the address she had for him. The letter had not been returned, which meant it had arrived, which meant he had chosen not to respond. And Ruth had filed that understanding in the same place she filed most difficult truths, which was somewhere she could access without being destroyed by it. Mrs. Patton came over at 9 with 2 cups of coffee she had made in her own kitchen and carried across the street with the careful attention of a woman in her 80s who has decided that visiting is worth the effort of carrying hot beverages. She asked about the grandchildren. Ruth smiled. She said they're busy. They're very important people now. Mrs. Patton said you must be proud. Ruth said I am. She said it plainly because it was true. Whatever else was also true, the pride was real. She had raised 2 children who had built significant lives, and she was proud of the building even when the builders had forgotten where they came from. The phone rang at 10:30. It was Bernard. He said, "Ruth, Thomas is gone. The will is being executed this week." He paused. "It's time to take your seat." Ruth looked at the vegetable garden from the porch, the orderly rows of green in the morning light, the tomatoes that needed another 3 days before they were ready to be staked. She said, "I'll need to water the tomatoes before I go, Bernard. Can you give me until Friday?" Bernard said, "Ruth, you are the majority shareholder of Caldwell and Associates. As of this morning, you are the most powerful person in that building." Ruth said, "And as of this morning, the tomatoes still need water, Bernard." Bernard was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Friday it is." She had always known the difference between what was urgent and what was important. The tomatoes were important. Everything else would keep until Friday. Ruth packed her overnight bag with the methodical care she brought to everything, folding each item before placing it, checking the list she had written on the notepad she kept on the dresser, because she had always kept a list for travel, even for one night, even for a drive she had made before. The bag was the same one she had used since 1988. It was a good bag, solid canvas with leather handles, and it had held what it needed to hold for 36 years without complaint, which she considered a reasonable standard for any object. Above the dresser, 2 photographs. Victor at his college graduation, 22 years old, in the blue gown of the State University, squinting into the sun with the slightly overwhelmed expression of someone standing at the beginning of something large. Diane, 3 years later, the same university, the same sun, the expression different from her brother's, more certain, more forward-leaning, already looking past the moment toward the next one. Ruth touched each photograph before she closed the bag. She had touched them this way every morning for years, not as ritual, but as the particular gesture of a woman who understood that the people in the photographs were still the people in the photographs, even when the people themselves had become something more complicated. 12 years ago, Victor had called her from the city on the evening of his first day at Caldwell and Associates. His voice had been the voice she knew, the voice of her son, when he was genuinely happy, and he had talked for 40 minutes about the office, and the people and the work and the sense of possibility that the city carried for him, and Ruth had sat at the kitchen table in the Millhaven and listened to all of it with the complete attention she had given him since he was born. And when they hung up, she had sat for a while in the kitchen with her tea and felt the particular pride of a mother whose child has arrived somewhere they had been working toward for a long time. That had been the last genuinely warm phone call she could remember, not because something dramatic happened, because nothing dramatic happened. Victor's ascent at Caldwell and Associates was gradual and consistent, each promotion arriving on schedule, each new responsibility bringing new language, new concerns, new colleagues who occupied the space that Ruth had previously occupied in his conversations. He stopped calling on Sundays. He stopped mentioning her at the industry events his assistant told him to prepare remarks for. He became, in the context of his professional life, a man without a visible origin, which was a choice so slow and so incremental that she was not sure he had ever made it consciously. Diane came to the firm 3 years after Victor, following the path he had cleared, with the particular efficiency of a younger sibling who has watched an older one find a route and has decided to take it. She was talented in ways Victor was not, more precise, more socially fluent, better at reading rooms. She was also, Ruth had come to understand, more deliberate in her erasure. Victor had drifted away. Diane had made adjustments. The moment Ruth had understood this most clearly was the year Diane mentioned at a company dinner to a colleague who asked about family that she was essentially an only child. A friend of a friend who knew someone who attended that dinner had mentioned it to someone in Millhaven, who had eventually mentioned it to Ruth, not cruelly, just in passing, the way small-town information moved. Ruth had heard it and had sat with it for several days, and had then put it in the category of things that were true and painful, and that she could not change, and that she would not allow to make her bitter, because bitterness required ongoing investment, and she had a garden and a classroom and a life that made demands she preferred to meet. The last visit had been 4 years ago. Victor had come with his new wife, a woman named Claire, who was accomplished and pleasant, and who looked at Ruth's house with the expression of someone performing an assessment they had not been asked to perform. They had stayed 2 hours. Claire had asked questions about the neighborhood with the polite incomprehension of someone who could not locate the neighborhood's value on any scale they used for measurement. Victor had been careful and kind in the careful, kind way of someone managing a situation. They had said they would come again soon. They had not come again. That year's letter from Thomas had been longer than usual. He had written, "I saw Victor at the firm retreat, Ruth. He is doing well. He presents himself well, and the partners regard him highly. He does not speak of you. I speak of you enough for both of us. I want you to know that I have not forgotten what you told me when we were 22, that the best measure of a person was how they treated the people who could do nothing for them. I have tried to build this firm on that principle. I have not always succeeded, but I have tried. I think of you when I try." Ruth had read that paragraph 3 times. She had pressed the letter into the Bible beside the clover and had gone out to water the tomatoes and had thought about Thomas in his office in the city, watching her son move through the firm's corridors without mentioning her name, and writing to her about it in his careful way, the way of a man who wanted her to know she was seen, even when others had chosen not to see her. Now she closed the overnight bag. She looked at the graduation photographs one more time. The empty space on the wall where the family photograph had hung until it fell during the windstorm of 2019, and the glass broke, and she had not replaced it because somehow she had not gotten around to it. The nail still in the wall, the pale rectangle where the paint had been protected by the frame. she said quietly to the photographs and to the room and to the 12 years that had passed since that first phone call you climbed. I know. I watched every step. She picked up the bag. She was not abandoned by strangers. She was left behind by the two people she had driven to every game and every audition and every graduation, the two people whose photographs she had touched every morning for 12 years. She had never once stopped being proud of them. They had just stopped letting her. The Wednesday morning at Caldwell and Associates had the quality of all Wednesday mornings there, which was the quality of a place that ran on schedule and expected the schedule to hold. Victor was in his glass office on the 14th floor with the merger proposal open on his screen, a proposal he had been preparing for 3 weeks, and that he expected to present to the senior partners on Friday. He had his coffee and his notes and the controlled forward momentum of a man who knows what the day contains and has arranged himself accordingly. Diane was on a call in the conference room down the hall, visible through the glass partition, her posture the precise posture of a woman conducting a conversation she has conducted many times and has perfected the presentation of. The elevator opened at 9:20. Bernard came through first, which was how Bernard always arrived, with the deliberate pace of a man who had been practicing law for 40 years and had long since stopped performing urgency. He was 67 years old, and he carried a leather briefcase that had been with him since his first year of practice, and he moved through the lobby of Caldwell and Associates with the ease of someone who had been here many times and was here today for a specific and long-anticipated purpose. Behind him, Ruth. She was wearing the floral blouse and carrying the bag she had packed in Millhaven on Friday morning, the canvas bag with the leather handles, and she looked at the lobby of Caldwell and Associates with the attentive interest of someone seeing for the first time a place they have heard described for 50 years. Nora was at the reception desk. She looked up when the elevator opened, the automatic professional attention of someone whose job required immediate assessment of arrivals, and she looked at Bernard and then at Ruth. And something in her expression shifted in the particular way of a young woman from a small town encountering an older woman from a small town, the recognition of a kind of person she knew how to see. She came around the desk. She said, "Good morning. Can I get you some water? Would you like to sit down while Bernard checks in?" Ruth said, "That's very kind of you." She set her bag on the reception desk and looked at Nora with the direct attention she had given to every student who had ever sat in her classroom. She said, "What's your name?" Nora said, Nora Chen. Ruth said, "That's a strong name. My best student was a Nora. She thought she wanted to be a marine biologist and ended up running the county library, which turned out to be exactly right." Nora smiled. Bernard set the formal document on the desk in front of the receptionist on duty and said, "Mrs. Ruth Hargrove is here for the shareholder orientation. Please notify the board that she has arrived." The receptionist looked at the document. Then she looked at her screen. Then she picked up the phone. On the 14th floor, Victor looked up from his screen. He had the peripheral awareness of his floor that came from 19 years in this building, the sense of its rhythms, the recognition of what belonged and what did not. Something in the lobby below his glass office was different from the usual Wednesday morning configuration, and he looked down without entirely deciding to. He saw the back of a silver-haired woman's head. He did not recognize her immediately. She was out of context, the way certain things are out of context when they appear in places they have never appeared before, and his mind processed the silver hair and the floral blouse and the canvas bag on the glass desk, and arrived at recognition in the slow way of something that the mind is resisting. He stood up. He came to the glass wall of his office and looked down at the lobby, and the silver-haired woman turned slightly, and he saw her profile. He went to the elevator. Bernard was waiting for him in the lobby when he arrived, which told Victor that Bernard had known he would come down quickly. Victor said, pulling Bernard to the side of the lobby near the plan arrangement, "What is my mother doing here? Is she a client? Did someone contact her about the estate? Did she call the firm?" Bernard said no one called her, Victor. She was already here. He paused. "She has always been here." Victor looked at him. Bernard's expression had the quality of a man who has been waiting to say something for a long time and has arrived at the moment and is allowing himself the full satisfaction of it without rushing. Victor looked at his mother. Ruth was at Thomas Caldwell's portrait. It hung in the lobby where it had always hung the large oil painting from 1987, Thomas in his 50s, with the expression Ruth had known for 52 years, the expression of a man who found everything interesting and was paying careful attention to all of it. She was standing in front of it the way she had stood in front of it when she arrived, with the complete stillness of someone who is not performing looking, but simply looking. She touched the frame. Diane's call ended. She came out of the conference room with the residual focus of someone finishing a conversation and transitioning to the next item, and she walked across the open floor toward her office and looked down through the atrium glass at the lobby below. She stopped walking. She stood very still in the middle of the 14th floor of the company she had worked at for 9 years, the company where she had told people she was essentially an only child, the company where she had built an identity that was entirely separate from the small town and the garden and the woman who had packed her lunches and driven her to every audition and sat in the bleachers in every weather. Her mother was standing in the lobby, holding her canvas bag, in front of Thomas Caldwell's portrait. Ruth turned around. She saw Victor first standing near Bernard with the expression of a man whose understanding of a situation is in the process of fundamental revision. Then she saw Diane on the upper floor at the glass railing looking down. Ruth looked at them both. She did not move toward them. She did not open her arms or adjust her expression toward the warmth of reunion or do any of the things a mother might do when she sees her children after 4 years. She nodded. The way a teacher nods at students who have arrived late and taken their seats, acknowledging their presence without making an event of it. The nod that says, "I see you, we will continue now." They had spent years hiding their small-town mother from their corporate world. She had just walked through the front door. She had not needed an invitation. She had, as it turned out, always had a key. Bernard closed the conference room door. The room was small, the kind of conference room used for conversations that did not require a large table and benefited from a certain enclosure, and the 4 of them sat around it with the particular arrangement of people who have very different understandings of why they are there. Bernard had his briefcase. Victor had his expression of controlled assessment. Diane had the expression she used when she was processing something and had not yet decided how to respond to it. Ruth had her canvas bag, which she set on the floor beside her chair, and the Bible, which she placed on the table in front of her. She opened it to the first letter. The envelope was cream-colored, the paper inside thin with age, the handwriting on it. The handwriting of a young man looser than it would become in later years, the letters larger and less certain. She said, "I think it's time you met Thomas properly." Victor said, "We knew Thomas. We worked for him for 19 years combined." Ruth said, "You worked for the company he built. That's different from knowing Thomas." She looked at the letter in her hands. "He was the boy at the county fair in 1969 who taught me to catch fireflies. I was 17. He was 17. His family had the farm 2 counties over, and he came to the fair with his older brother, and we ended up at the same fence watching the same bad juggler for 20 minutes before either of us said anything." Diane looked at the photograph that Ruth had placed on the table beside the Bible. Black and white 1971, 2 young people at a county fair, the woman recognizable as Ruth in the specific way that young people are recognizable in old photographs, the bone structure and the posture, and the quality of attention in the eyes. The man beside her was Thomas Caldwell, 20 years old, laughing at something outside the frame. Ruth said he left for the city in 1972. I married Harold in 1973 and stayed. We wrote letters. He called when the telephone rates went down enough to make it reasonable. We saw each other when we could, which was not often because life was what it was, and the distance was real. She said when he was 19 years old, sitting on a fence at a county fair, he told me what he wanted to build. He said he wanted to make something that would make a good teacher proud. She paused. I didn't know until much later that I was the teacher he meant. Victor said, "What do you mean you didn't know?" Ruth said, he didn't tell me directly for a long time. He wrote about the company and the letters about the decisions he was making and why. And I wrote back with what I thought. And he listened. She turned to a letter from 1984 and read a single paragraph. Thomas had written, "We implemented the December policy this year. No terminations in December. The way you said a person's dignity should never be sacrificed for a quarterly number, and it has changed the culture of the firm in ways I can already see. I owe you that one, Ruthie." She turned to another letter, 1991. He had written, "The community fund is fully operational. We are dedicating 3% of annual profit to the counties our employees come from. Your idea, your words, almost verbatim. I keep a notebook of our conversations. It is the closest thing I have to a business philosophy document." Victor said, "This is a business, Mom, not a friendship correspondence. What does a county fair in 1971 have to do with the shareholder meeting?" Bernard placed the document on the table. He placed it in front of Ruth first, which was the correct order, and then turned it so Victor and Diane could read it. The document was the shareholder certificate official and specific Ruth Elaine Hargrove, listed as the holder of 51% of the controlling shares of Caldwell and Associates, the transfer effective the date of Thomas Caldwell's death 6 weeks prior. Victor looked at the document. He looked at it for long enough that the looking became its own kind of statement. "Diane said you own." She stopped. "You own the company." Ruth said Thomas owned it. "He gave it to me because he said I built it with him. He just happened to be the one who went to the city." She paused. "He wrote me that in the letter that came the year Harold died. He said, 'Ruthie, I want you to know that everything I made from the conversations we had on that fence and in those letters, and when I'm gone, I want you to have the proof of that because you deserve to know what your thinking built.'" Diane looked at the photograph on the table. Young Ruth and young Thomas at the county fair, 2 19-year-olds standing at a fence, Thomas laughing, and Ruth looking at him with the expression of someone who has found the person they can think out loud with and is fully aware of the rarity of that. Victor looked at it too. He picked it up. He looked at it for a long moment, and Ruth watched her son look at the photograph of his mother at 19 years old, a woman he had spent 4 years not calling a woman he had described to colleagues as essentially not present in his life, and she watched him encounter the 52 years of friendship and loyalty and intellectual partnership that he had not known existed and had never thought to ask about. Victor set the photograph down. He said, "Why didn't you tell us any of this?" Diane said quietly, "Why didn't you ever tell us?" Ruth looked at her daughter. "She said you never asked about my friend's sweetheart. She said it without accusation, the way she said most true things, as an observation. You were always very busy with your own." Victor said there has to be a legal challenge here. This transfer, the circumstances of it, the relationship between you and Thomas, the lack of any formal business arrangement. Ruth put her hand on the Bible. She said Victor. She said it the way she had said his name when he was 12 years old and was working himself into an argument that was not going to help him, and she needed him to stop and listen. "Victor." He stopped. "She said I didn't come here to fight you." She looked at him and then at Diane with the same steady attention she had given them their entire lives, the attention that did not require anything from them in return, but that had always been there, present and constant and undiminished by their distance from it. "She said I came because Bernard said it was time, and because it was finally time to visit where you work." The conference room was quiet. 20 years of absence turned over in one sentence placed on the table between them as gently as Ruth had placed the Bible. He had built his entire professional identity on leaving her behind. He had no idea she had already arrived. The boardroom of Caldwell and Associates occupied the entire northeast corner of the 14th floor, with windows on 2 sides that looked out over the city in the particular way of rooms designed to remind the people in them of the scale of what they were doing. The table was long and the chairs were substantial, and the company's mission statement was mounted on the wall, in the kind of framing that communicated permanence rather than decoration. The board had assembled by 10 o'clock. There were 11 of them, the senior partners and the outside directors and the 2 representatives from the Employees' Trust, and they arranged themselves around the table with the careful positioning of people who understood that something significant was happening and had not yet determined its full shape. Some were uneasy, the unease of people whose assumptions about a situation have been revised without their participation. Some were curious, in the way of people who have been told something that does not fit the established narrative and are waiting for the explanation. One, a woman in her late 60s named Margaret Osei, who had been on the board for 14 years, was sitting with her hands folded and an expression that was not quite a smile, but was in the same direction the expression of someone who has been waiting for a specific thing to happen and is watching it happen. Bernard introduced Ruth at the door. He said, "The board of Caldwell and Associates, it is my privilege to introduce Mrs. Ruth Elaine Hargrove, majority shareholder and chair of the board, effective the date of Mr. Thomas Caldwell's passing." Ruth walked to the head of the table. She stood behind Thomas's chair. She put one hand on the back of it, the carved wood of the top rail, and she looked at the room with the attention she had brought to every classroom she had ever stood in front of, the attention of someone who is taking the measure of a space and the people in it before proceeding. She did not sit down yet. Victor was on her left, 2 chairs down, and he had been attempting since they left the small conference room to locate the frame that would make this manageable, the professional frame that would allow him to be a senior vice president managing an unusual situation, rather than a son encountering the specific and irreversible consequence of 20 years of choices. He said, "I want the board to know that my mother has traveled a significant distance this morning, and this is a great deal to process. Perhaps we give her a moment before we begin the formal agenda." Ruth said, "I'm overwhelmed by the view, Victor, but I'm fine with the agenda." Margaret Osei looked at the table. She did not change her expression, but something in her posture settled slightly, the way a person settles when something they hoped would happen has happened. Ruth opened the canvas bag. She took out a letter. Not the most recent one, not the first one, but one from the middle of the archive, 1989, the year Caldwell and Associates had moved into this building, and Thomas had written to her from the new office on the first day, describing what it looked like and what he intended it to become. She read aloud. She read the paragraph that began, "I have been thinking about what we said at Christmas about the purpose of a company, about whether a company can be accountable to the people it comes from, the way a teacher is accountable to her students. And I have decided to put it in the founding documents." She read the paragraph that followed, in which Thomas had written word for word the language of the mission statement that was mounted on the wall of this boardroom in the framing that communicated permanence. She stopped reading. She looked at the wall. The board looked at the wall. Margaret Osei said, "That is the mission statement." Ruth said yes. She took out a second letter, 1994. She read the passage about the community fund, the 3% of annual profit, designated for the counties from which the firm's employees came. Thomas writing, "Your idea exactly. Ruthie, the one you said when we talked about what your school district lost when the factory closed, and I've had Bernard structure it into the charter so it cannot be removed by any future board without unanimous consent." She put the second letter on the table. She took out a third, 1997. She read the December policy, "No terminations in the month of December." Thomas writing, "You said a person's dignity should never be made collateral damage for a quarterly number, and you were right, as you usually are, and it is now in the employment covenant." She set the third letter beside the second. The boardroom was quiet in the way of a room that has received information requiring adjustment. Margaret Osei said, "Mrs. Hargrove, are you saying that Thomas Caldwell based the company charter on conversations he had with you?" Ruth said, "I'm saying Thomas was kind enough to credit good ideas wherever he found them." She paused. He was generous that way. A board member named Harrison, who was 54 and had been at the firm for 16 years and had always understood the mission statement as Thomas Caldwell's particular genius, looked at the wall and then at Ruth, and then at the wall again with the expression of a man whose understanding of a foundational document is in the process of revision. Victor had not spoken. He was looking at the mission statement on the wall. He was reading it. Ruth had watched her son read many things over the course of his life, had watched him read his first books and his first report cards, and the letter from the university, and the offer from Caldwell and Associates, and she recognized the quality of attention he was bringing to the wall, now the particular intensity of someone reading something for the first time that they have seen many times before. Bernard placed the modernization proposal on the table. It had been submitted to the board by Victor 3 weeks ago, a 40-page document outlining a series of structural changes to the firm's operating model. Ruth picked it up. She read it the way she read everything from the beginning and without skipping, and the boardroom waited with the quality of a room that is decided collectively to hold its position while something important is determined. She reached the section on the community fund. She read it in silence. She turned 4 more pages and read the section on the December policy, which the proposal described as an operational inefficiency with measurable cost impact that should be reviewed for amendment. She set the proposal on the table. She said Thomas would have said no. She paused. She said, "I say no." She sat down in the chair, Thomas's chair, at the head of the table, the chair that had been empty for 6 weeks, and that she had been standing behind since she entered the room. She sat in it with the same quality she brought to every chair she had ever sat in completely and without apology, and she looked at the board from the head of the table. The proposal sat where she had placed it face down, which was its answer. Victor was still looking at the mission statement on the wall. He was reading the words his mother had said to her closest friend in letters over 52 years, the words that had become the charter of the company he had given his professional life to the company he had used to build an identity separate from the woman who had generated the ideas that were mounted on its wall in the framing that communicated permanence. He had spent 20 years serving a company his mother helped build. He had just voted to dismantle the part of it that came from her, and he had not known until now. Victor found her in the hallway after the meeting ended. She was at the window at the end of the corridor, the one that faced west, and showed the city in its midday configuration, the buildings and the streets and the particular gray-blue of a city sky in summer. She had her hands folded in front of her, and she was looking out at it with the same quality of attention she brought to the vegetable garden in the early morning, the attention of someone who finds what they are looking at genuinely interesting and is not in any hurry to look away. Victor had loosened his tie. He stood beside her for a moment without speaking, which was not his usual way, but which was the way available to him at this particular moment, and Ruth did not turn from the window to acknowledge his arrival because she had heard him coming, and he knew she had heard him, and the acknowledgement was therefore unnecessary. He said, "Mom." He said it the way he had said it in the small conference room without the management in it, the name arriving plain. He said, "I was building something. I needed to be someone who had built themselves from nothing. I didn't want you to see me fail. I was trying to protect you from the parts of it that were hard." Ruth said, "Victor, the man you told your colleagues was dead was not dead. He was alive, living in Millhaven, watching the slideshow of your career from the letters Thomas sent her every year and thinking that whatever else was true, you were doing exactly what she had always believed you could do." Victor was quiet. Ruth said he was watching your presentations at firm retreats on the slides Thomas described to her. She had the slides in her mind from Thomas's descriptions, the quarterly reports and the strategy documents and the presentations Victor had delivered that Thomas had attended, and then written to her about with the specific generosity of a man who understood that a mother needed to hear that her son was brilliant, even when the son had stopped telling her himself. Victor said you knew about the gala. He said it the way you say something when you already know the answer and are simply confirming that the other person has the same information you do. Ruth turned from the window. She looked at her son. He was 47 years old, and he had his father's height and his father's jaw, and her eyes the same eyes she saw in the graduation photograph on her dresser mirror every morning. And he looked standing in the hallway with his tie loosened, and the afternoon light on his face like the boy she had driven to school and to practice, and to every occasion his life had required someone to drive him to, and she felt for him what she had always felt, which was a love that did not require anything from him to continue existing. Bernard had excused himself quietly at the end of the corridor, which was what Bernard did when a room required privacy, which was one of the many things she appreciated about Bernard. Ruth opened the canvas bag. She took out the last letter. The envelope was dated 8 weeks ago, 6 weeks before Thomas died, written in the last month of his life, when his handwriting had changed from what it had been in his 50s, but remained legible because Thomas had always been deliberate about legibility. She found the paragraph. She read it aloud. Thomas had written, "I saw Victor at the annual gala last month, Ruthie. He was at the table near the window, the one I always put the best people at, and a colleague introduced us and asked Victor about his family. He said his mother was gone. Not gone as in lives in Millhaven. Gone as in no longer living. I didn't correct him. I thought about it, and I decided that you would want the chance to do that yourself. He had written, "I am sorry I didn't tell you sooner. I have been carrying this for 3 years." Ruth folded the letter. She put it back in the envelope and held it. Victor said, "Mom." He said it, and then he stopped in the hallway, held the stopped sentence for a moment. The weight of a man who has arrived at something he has been moving toward and away from simultaneously for 20 years, and has finally arrived at it without any remaining direction to move in except through it. He said, "I'm sorry." He said it simply, the way true apologies are simple, without the elaboration that turns apologies into explanations or the qualifications that turn them into negotiations. Just the 2 words, which were the correct 2 words, and which arrived in Ruth's ears with the specific quality of something she had not known she was still waiting for until it came. Ruth looked at her son. She did not hug him yet. She had a question she had been carrying for longer than she could precisely identify, a question that had been forming itself in the background of 20 years of Sunday dinners, with extra plates and phone numbers that changed without new ones arriving and letters answered with silence, and she needed to ask it before anything else could happen. She said, "Victor, why? What was so shameful about me?" The question was not angry. It was the question of a woman who has accepted a great deal without understanding it, and has finally arrived at the place where she can ask directly. Victor looked out the window at the city. He was quiet for long enough that the city outside continued its ordinary motion, a taxi changing lanes, a cloud moving across the pale summer sky, the life of a place that did not know or care about the conversation happening at a window on the 14th floor. He said, "I was ashamed of myself, Mom, not you." He said it to the window first and then turned and said it to her. He said, "I thought if they saw where I came from, they would see who I really was, who I was before all of this. And I was afraid that person wasn't enough." Ruth looked at him. She said, "That's exactly who I wanted them to see." Victor looked at her. She said, "The boy from Millhaven who worked hard and kept going and built something real. That's the person I wanted them to know. That's the person I was proud of. Not the title Victor, not the office." She paused. "You." Diane was in the doorway at the end of the hall. She had come out of the boardroom and had walked toward them and had stopped when she understood what she was walking into. And she was standing now with her hand on the doorframe, listening with the expression of a woman receiving something through her brother that she understood was also meant for her. The same thing said in the same hallway, waiting for the same conversation. He had spent 20 years running from his own reflection. She had spent 20 years preserving it in a garden and a small house and a Bible full of letters from a man who had watched everything and had written it all down for the day her son was ready to look. Ruth found Diane in the small conference room. The door was open, which Ruth took as an invitation, of a kind, the open door of a person who has not decided whether they want company, but has not closed themselves off from it either. Diane was sitting in the chair she had sat in during the revelation, the chair on the right side of the table with the window at her back, and she was looking at the shareholder document that was still on the table where Bernard had left it. She did not look up when Ruth came in. Ruth sat down across from her. She set the canvas bag on the floor and the Bible on the table, and she looked at her daughter with the full, unhurried attention she had always given her, the attention that Diane had grown up in and had moved away from, and that was still here unchanged, waiting in the way that certain things wait when they are not contingent on being received. Diane said, "I told people I was an only child mom." She said it before Ruth could say anything, which told Ruth something about where Diane had been sitting with it, that it had come to the front of everything and needed to be said first before any other accounting could begin. Ruth said, "I know." Diane looked up. Ruth said a colleague of yours was at a conference 2 years ago with someone who knew someone in Millhaven. Word travels even from the city. She said it without accusation, as an observation of the way information moved through the world, which was in the same patterns it had always moved through the connections between people who had come from the same places. Diane said I followed Victor. She said it with the honesty of someone who has moved past the justifications and arrived at the plain thing underneath. He made himself into someone the city would take seriously, and I did the same thing. I thought if I had a small town in my past, it would make me smaller. I thought erasing it would make me more. She paused. It just made me feel hollow. Ruth looked at her daughter. Diane was 44 years old, and she had Ruth's hands and Harold's way of holding her shoulders when she was uncertain, the slight forward set of someone bracing against something, and she looked in this moment more like the child she had been than the senior account manager she had become, which was the way certain rooms and certain conversations returned people to themselves. Ruth opened the Bible. She turned to the pages near the middle where the clover had been kept since Thomas gave it back to her in 1971. After she found it in the grass near the ring toss, and then dropped it in the excitement of showing him. He had picked it up without her seeing and kept it until the end of the day and pressed it into her hand when they said goodbye and said, "For luck, Ruthie, you're going to need it for whatever comes next." She had needed it for a great many things. She took it out carefully, the four-leaf clover pressed flat for 52 years, preserved in the particular way of things that have been kept with intention, and she placed it on the table between her and Diane. She said you found one like this in the garden when you were 6 years old, in the patch near the fence where the clover grew thick in the summer. Do you remember? Diane looked at the clover on the table. She said I brought it inside. I said it meant we'd always be lucky. Ruth said you put it on the kitchen windowsill. You said the sun would keep it good. Diane's eyes were bright. Ruth said I kept it in the Bible after that summer. I moved it here when Thomas gave me his. She looked at the clover. I keep things that matter to me. Diane reached across the table. She picked up the clover. Her hands were not steady. She held it the way you hold something very old and very small that you did not expect to see again, with the particular care of someone who understands that the fragility is real and that what they are holding has been preserved by someone else's attention for a very long time. She said you kept it. Ruth said I keep things that matter to me. The conference room was quiet. Outside the window, the city continued its afternoon, and inside this small room, with the shareholder document and the canvas bag and the Bible open on the table, 2 women sat with 40 years between them and the small pressed leaf of a clover that a 6-year-old had found in a garden and a mother had kept, because that was what she did with things that mattered. Diane said, "What do you want from us, Mom?" She said it not as a challenge, but as a genuine question, the question of a woman who has run out of assumptions and is asking plainly. She said, "Money, an apology. What do you actually want?" Ruth said, "I want to make you dinner, Diane." She said it the way she said most things, plainly and without drama. She said, "I've been saving my good recipes, the ones that take all day. I want to make them for someone who will stay long enough to eat them." Diane looked at her. Ruth said, "I'm not going to dismantle your careers. I'm not going to call a press conference or embarrass you in front of your colleagues." She paused. "I'm going to run this company the way Thomas ran it, which is the way I would have run it if I had been the one who went to the city." She said, "I asked for one thing. Come home for Sunday dinner. Once a month? Not because I need you to, because I want to know you again." She looked at her daughter. "The people you are now? Not just the children you were." Diane looked at the clover in her hand. She looked at it for a long moment. This small, preserved thing that her mother had carried for 52 years, alongside the letters of a man who had watched everything and written it all down. This small evidence that she had been a child, in a garden, who believed in luck, and had been loved completely by a woman who kept the proof of it. She closed her hand around it. She nodded. It was not forgiveness, not yet, not the full thing that would take time and dinners and the slow, patient work of people finding their way back to each other. But it was the door opening, which was where everything had to begin. Ruth had not asked them to make up for 20 years. She had only asked for the next Sunday. She had always been a practical woman. 3 weeks later, Ruth set the table for 3. She did it in the morning before she went to the garden because she wanted it to be ready, and she wanted to see it ready when she came back inside the 3 plates and the 3 glasses and the good cloth napkins she had kept in the drawer since Harold died, and had not had occasion to use for a dinner this size in 12 years. She straightened each setting with the same attention she brought to everything, and then she went out to the garden in the early light. The tomatoes were ready. She picked them with the deliberate selection of someone who has grown things long enough to know exactly what ready looks like, the color and the give and the particular weight of a tomato that has had the time it needed. She set them on the counter in the kitchen beside the basil she had cut from the pot on the windowsill and looked at them for a moment with the satisfaction of someone whose patience has produced exactly the result patience produces when it is applied to the right things. The Bible was back on its shelf. The clover was inside it. Victor arrived at 11. He came to the door in jeans and a plain shirt, no jacket, no tie, and Ruth looked at him standing on her porch and saw the boy in the graduation photograph, not because the years were gone, but because the performance of them was the careful construction of the person he had been maintaining in the city, temporarily set aside, in the way that certain things can be set aside when you are in the right place with the right person. He came in and looked at the kitchen, and then he went to the window that faced the garden. He looked at the tomatoes on the vine, the ones she had not yet picked, the late-season ones still finding their color in the September sun. He said, "They're bigger than I remember." Ruth said they had more time. She said it the way she said most true things, without weight on it, just the observation. And Victor stood at the window and received it, and she let it be what it was, which was both an answer about tomatoes and a sentence about other things, and she did not need to say which. Diane arrived at 11:30 with a pie. She carried it in both hands the way you carry something you have made and are uncertain about the careful grip of someone who wants to deliver a thing intact and is not entirely sure it deserves to arrive. The crust was cracked along one side, where it had separated during baking, and Diane looked at it when she set it on the counter with the expression of someone identifying a flaw. Ruth looked at the pie. She said, "That's perfect." Diane said the crust cracked. Ruth said, "I know. It's perfect." She touched the edge of it gently. "She said your grandmother's crust always cracked. She said it was because she made it in a hurry trying to get everything done at once." She paused. "What did you make it with?" Diane said, "Apples. From the market. And the cinnamon from your cabinet you said I could." Ruth said then, "It's perfect. It smells like your grandmother's kitchen, and it cracked the way hers did, and that makes it exactly right." Diane looked at the pie and then at Ruth, and something in her shoulders changed the slight release of a woman who has been bracing against something and has been given permission to stop. They sat at the table at noon. Victor said, "I've been thinking about the company." He said it carefully the way he said things now when he was not sure of the reception, which was a new quality in him and one Ruth found she appreciated. He said, "You could really run it, Mom. You understand it better than any of us. You could come to the city. You could be in every meeting." Ruth said, "I am running it, Victor. I've been running it from my porch for 20 years. She said it without pride, just as the fact it was. And Victor looked at his plate and then at his mother with the expression she had seen in the hallway at Caldwell, and associates the expression of a man encountering the full picture of something he had seen only partially for a very long time. She said, "I'm going to be a silent majority. That's what Thomas was for 30 years in his way, and it's what I'll be. Bernard will watch the company's character, and I'll be here. If something needs me, Bernard will call." She paused. The garden needs daily attention. The company needs someone who understands what it's for. Those aren't the same job. Victor said, "I'm sorry I made you invisible, Mom." He said it the way he had said things in the hallway without management, just plainly. The first real sentence of the real conversation they were going to spend the next years having. Ruth said, "You didn't make me invisible, Victor. You just weren't looking. There's a difference." She passed him the bread. She said, "Now eat your dinner before it gets cold." She bowed her head. She said grace in the way she had always said grace, simply and without performance, the words she had used since she was a girl at her own mother's table, words that were old-fashioned and true, and that asked for nothing except gratitude for what was present. Victor and Diane bowed their heads, and the kitchen was quiet, in the way of a room that is holding something it has been waiting to hold. Then Ruth passed the tomatoes. The ones she had grown in the garden behind the house while her children were building careers in a city 2 hours away. The ones she had watered on the morning Bernard called to tell her Thomas was gone, and it was time. The ones that had needed 3 more days when Bernard said she was the most powerful person in a building she had never entered, and she had asked for those 3 days because the tomatoes were important and everything else would keep. Victor took the bowl. He put 2 on his plate and passed it to Diane. Diane took the bowl with both hands, the same hands that had held the 4-leaf clover in the conference room 3 weeks ago, and she served herself and set the bowl in the center of the table where it belonged. The 3 of them ate. The kitchen had the smell of Sunday dinner, the particular smell of food, made with time and attention, and the specific ingredients of a place that has been tended. And outside the window, the September garden was doing what gardens do in September, which is to give the last of what they have before the season turns. Ruth had not chased them. She had not begged. She had tended her garden and kept her letters and wound the years forward with the patience of a woman who understood that the things worth having were worth waiting for, and that the waiting itself was not empty, but full of tomatoes and pressed clovers and the annual letters of a man who had built a company from her ideas and had spent 52 years making sure she would know it. The company and the clover and the table all told the same story. The things that grow slowly are always the ones that last.